you, Ellen. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm really delighted to be here at the Atlas to give this talk today. So as Ellen was saying, I'm an Irish Fulbright Scholar here just for the semester, and I'm hosted by Theatre and Dance, but I'm loitering with intent in the Atlas Institute, and I've been going to the weekly meetings of the Untitled Design Lab because I'm really interested in textiles. So instead, I'm going to go through just talk through some of the work that I've done that specifically involves textiles technology, and then I'm going to talk about what I'm doing here this semester, and I have a residency in B2 at the end of October and the beginning of November, which I'm really excited about. And but I just wanted to say at the outset that one of the things that's really important to me as an artist is moving across disciplines in a way that is kind of irreverent and excited and interested, but also doesn't see them. Hi, there are chairs over here, actually. There's probably one there. That's really sees them as equal but different. And also, because I've moved across different discipline contexts often in my career and continue to do so, I'm really interested in what those differences are. So I've made, I had a whole period where I was making broadcast radio, for example, when my kids were little at home and I couldn't be dancing around and touring like I used to, and that has a whole different world. But I also wanted to emphasize the through lines for me, and the through lines for me are also always a sense of playfulness and curiosity, and also story and creative writing, which I'm always a writer, whatever discipline I'm in. In terms of my tangles with textiles and technology, it's when I've worked with technologies of different kinds in different contexts, it's always been how can I collaborate with people and really elaborate story and make things more haunting or more playful or more grounded or perceivable in a different way. So just to kind of say that at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to start at the very beginning, early in my career. So I got a scholarship to come to Boulder, Colorado when I was a young woman in 1987, and I came here to do my MA in theatre and dance. It was a real, an extraordinary time for me. I didn't even know anything about the US, didn't know where I was coming really. And the reason I'm back here now is because my research interests specifically have really moved around climate, and this. So I'll be talking about some of that work today, and because of the research range of work that there is here in Boulder. But before I get into that, I'm going to just go back to some early work and look at, this is the first work that I made. It was made in 1977 in a format that doesn't even exist anymore, called CD-ROM. You might be too young. You might be too young to even know what that is. So this, while I scroll, it's a bit slow. So maybe I won't do that. Okay. Oh, sorry, I've got that bit here. Go back here. So this was a project that had huge amounts of sites in it, and it was for a computer, and it was the first time that I collaborated with a programmer, and it had 8 different sites in it, and one of them was needlework. So it was all about femininity and orality. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time in it here. I suppose what I really wanted to talk about is the installation in the gallery, which had 25,000 sewing needles hanging from the ceiling. And I don't, because it's so long ago, I don't have, really excellent documentation, but there's a few here. And I had to, in order to do this, I had to, recruit dozens of people to do this. But I wanted to make something really visible that is normally so invisible. And I wanted to have a sense that you had to go through this and around this to go to the clunky, very big Apple Mac computer at the end to look at the digital artwork. So, and it was interesting, that was the reaction, and I've no kind of, precise evidence for this, but my general sense was that it was quite gendered, the response, that in general, the kind of the men and boys who came found it quite intimidating. And the women were like, God, that took, hey, how did you do that? And they were interested in the mechanics of it. So it's really interesting. That's kind of the gallery setting. I wanted to just read a couple of, so here, this is where it was exhibited, you can see. And I'm just going to read one of the texts that was in the needlework section. These are games of needlework, unlikely and calculated. In war, the women would embroider faces of their captors slowly closed. Though they selected colours that befit the time of year and spent time on their designs, their silk would clot into a sewn frieze of black red. These bodies, they were sent back across the border, strapped to floating biers. If you look inside the mouth of a man whose face has been embroidered, you will find his tears collected in clear lozenges, hidden beneath his tongue. Embroider, to embellish with fictitious details and exaggerations. And I just wanted to share that text because it's clearly a violent text, but in writing something like that, I was really interested in reworking the passivity that we associate with femininity, especially in relation to needlework, and to imagine what it might be if something like needlework was an instrument of war. Okay. So I'm going to move on. I'm happy, obviously, to answer. If anybody has questions, because we're a relatively small group here, please ask as we go, because that was a huge work. And it was part of my practice-based PhD as well. And actually had my CD on in along with a VHS tape in the back of the documentation that I go, bless my cotton socks. So the people who were assessing my PhD, they would, as well as reading the thesis, they would look at this artwork. Okay, I'm going to move on a couple of years to Spinstren, and this was a dance theatre production from 2002. And the reason that I'm looking at that is for two reasons. One is that I did a whole series of collaborations around motion sensing technologies, and I was just chatting before with Ellen about some of the work that she's done and you've done here with motion sensing technology and performance. And in the late 90s, this was all kind of very new for dance, and there was a big, you might remember, Undine, there was maybe you're too young, there was a real excitement about the possibilities of dance and technology, and there were lots of festivals and so forth, and we were very much part of that time period, and for me it was before children, so I could zap around the world. The work that we were doing, it was a video-based motion sensing called Big Eye. And because I'm a writer and because we're interested in evoking poetic spaces, we worked a lot with pre-recorded samples of poem text and then dancers who were mic'd, improvising physically with triggering the sound and the movement, and then vocally improvising with that. So when it worked well, it didn't always work well, but when it worked well, it really felt as if the room was haunted, because you couldn't really tell. You knew that this vocalization was connected to this person's body. You know, you could see that the gesture connected, but she wasn't speaking, but then she would speak over that. And it kind of troubled time as well as it did that, because you couldn't quite tell. And obviously any documentation of this flattens it, especially in the late 90s, because you can't tell that difference between liveness and pre-recorded sample. And I wrote a lot about that. So I've published quite a few articles at the time, and part of my PhD was linked with that. So Spinstren was the second production that we did using those technologies. And this one was specifically around the idea of spinning. And it actually started from somebody who, a friend of mine who carves, a friend of my partner's who carves spinning tops for fun, actually. And he span this spinning top, and it did where it spanned so perfectly and intensively that it looked intensely still. And it felt to me like such a resonant metaphor for femininity, for that kind of whole gendered idea of kind of stillness and perfection, and yet madness spinning. And then I got really interested in myths of spinning, like Sleeping Beauty and Arachne, and the actual practice of spinning itself. So I wound this, this story, and so the texts are both texts that are based or developed on the story of Arachne. And if you don't know that story, it's a Greek myth where the goddess Athena is goddess of lots of things, war, but also spinning. And some young upstart slave girl called Arachne decides she, or starts saying that she is the best in the kingdom at weaving and spinning, but it's weaving in particular. And Arachne gets very cross, comes to her and whacks her over the head with her distaff and turns her into a spider. And that's the story. And of course, it's kind of resonant with all kinds of things. So I made, we made this dance piece that looked at that, and then also at Sleeping Beauty, with the idea that maybe the pricking of the finger was actually something extraordinary rather than a punishment, or some, that this sleep might be resonant in some way. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. There's some images here. I'll just have a quick scroll through. And again, they're not very good images because they are, that one's not too bad, but they're stills from videos. So they're, oops. This is two Arachnes on the table. And it was also, like a lot of my work, tends to move between raucous and poetic. That's a raucous bit. And okay. And that's Arachne at the end. Okay. So I wanted again just to read a very short texts here. You can see one of them here. She told me that if I bathed the distaff with blood, strange alchemies would come upon me. She told me that if I span and pricked my finger, I could exchange blood for knowledge. From Sleeping Beauty. And then not on here on the screen, that's where it was exhibited, but Arachne. Arachne hid the spindles of self-silk, but loved making them. And that whole work of self-silk, we worked choreographically with it because it's linguistically very gorgeous. And we were working with those technologies at the same time. So I am just going to play a very short video from there.
Angular momentum of an atomic nucleus. C. Non-negative integral or half-integral quantum number, which specifies such momentum in units of Planck's constant divided by 2 pi.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the knitting map now. It's a big jump to 2005. Now, the knitting map was a project. I'm going to pass around this book. You can kind of have a look at some images from it more than is here. So the knitting map was a large-scale community-based installation that was made during Cork's Year as European Capital of Culture in 2005. And it was based on all of this dance work. We'd done some installation work, but we got really interested, and we is Half Angel, myself and Richard Paval, a company that we had for 10 years. And we got really interested in how we could look at a whole city instead of a single dancer using technology. And as often happened when I was collaborating with Richard, I would dream up what the technology could do, based not on any kind of technical knowledge, but then that process of imagining was always important. And I think that we might call it blue sky thinking now, but I didn't even know that term then. But I had this idea that a satellite would look at the city of Cork, because we were going to be the European Capital of Culture. It's so extraordinary to have been designated as such. So we wanted to do something really glorious and wonderful. And so I said, well, look, could we not have a satellite looking at the city, and then we'll have a weather state, and that will kind of trigger the knitting stitch, and then we'll have a weather station, and that will link to the color. So most of that actually did happen. We couldn't use satellite, but we used 4 CCTV cameras in the city, And they looked at motion only because there was a lot of issues to do with security. So we weren't allowed to look at those images, but we could take the documentation of the movement. And then my colleague mapped that onto complexity of stitch. So if it was a very busy day and it didn't, because it was just movement, the CCTVs don't distinguish between people and traffic or birds or whatever, then the stitch generated would be complex. And if it was a quiet day, the stitch would be simple. And the weather station was linked to colour, and it had multiple data streams, and they were averaged, and we had a palette of colour, of wool colour, that was very muted, kind of blues and greens, some blues, and the very occasional purple, and lots of creams. And then we built a wooden amphitheatre in the crypt of the church, and we up to 20 people could knit every day, and we knitted every day for a year. So, and that has had a huge life. I'll show you some of the, actually I'll show you some of the making here of the women, largely older working class women from Cork who made the piece, but anybody could make it, could join in, and we would, I've got the knitters here. We would teach anybody to knit. So here's a picture just of some of the knitters knitting. The president, this is the president of Ireland at the time, Mary McAleese. She came to visit Cork. It was taken out. Here are some of the textures. I'll go back to the exhibitions. So it's been exhibited a few times. At the moment, right now, it's in the Berman Museum of Art in Pennsylvania. And I haven't seen this because I had to install it remotely on WhatsApp video, which was really challenging. My goodness. So as you can see here, it's in this beautiful space. It's a very large textile, and and what's wonderful about this exhibition, and which is really important to me actually, is that it's exhibited with Tempestries. And I was just saying to Dover this morning that I've been writing about the Tempestries and what they are. So Tempestries, there's some pictures here. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them, but they temperature blankets kind of existed before the Tempestry project which they started in 2017. But the Tempestry project, actually in reaction to Trump getting into office and all of his climate denial and the threat that climate information was going to be disappeared from government websites, they decided to document weather to formalize to have standardized colors for temperature, for 5-degree temperature differences. And they sell these kits, which are they're all bespoke and made for a particular place, for a particular place for a year. And they're kind of wall hangings, and you knit one row, or you crochet one row per day, depending on what the temperature is for that year. And they get their data from the National Oceanographic, I can't remember all of the acronym, but it's the government official place. So it's really good. It's just scientific data. Like, you can't argue with that in terms of both the colors and the temperatures. And the important thing is that you can do historic ones. So people have done comparative ones. And there's something about these in textile that really moves people in a different way to just the data. And that's true of climate scientists too. I found a lot of climate scientists who've used Tempestries or made Tempestries, and it really connects to people affectively, which is one of the things that's really important about art science collaborations. And it also, so it's a kind of climate activist process. So there's some of those here in this exhibition. So just a quick look through. In the exhibition in Pennsylvania, which I'll be going through next month, these are the names of all the knitters on the wall here. So here's, you can see some of the Tempestries on the wall, and then it's kind of nice because they kind of frame the knitting map through the atrium there. Here's some more. Okay. So you get some sense of the exhibition there. Okay. Okay. It was previously it was previously exhibited in the Glucksman Gallery in 2015, and the book is going round. And the book, which was published in 2019, give it there, is called Textiles, Community and Controversy, because it's the remit of this presentation, but the project was really controversial in Ireland, and it's really interesting to understand why that is, hence the book. But it was a really interesting complexity of it being knitting at a time where Ireland couldn't really see knitting as potentially transgressive, as something that could critique something only as fuddy-duddy. It's also about post-coloniality, in the sense that I think there was because it was one of the most visible projects for the year, and it was open every day for the year. So if you went to Cork for that year, you usually went to the knitting map. And I think there was a hesitancy about being represented internationally through knitting. It was kind of tabloid and things like, they would say things like, we don't want a bunch of old biddies knitting, we want the All Ireland, which is a sporting fixture, or you know, I'm sure it's fine in its own way. It's all kind of documented in that book, but this exhibition documented that, because basically I had about 10 years of journalists and journalists contacting me about it, and there was controversy about the amount of money it cost. So it cost 250,000 euros, which might seem like a lot, but actually it was over a couple of years. We had an entire art centre with people in for a year, and it's really telling when you look at what else was commissioned for that year. So for example, I don't know if you know architect Daniel Liebeskind, but he makes these beautiful, huge metal architectural caprices. And one of those, I think it was called 14 Turns, was in a park outside of Cork City for this year. And it cost the same amount of money, but there wasn't a whisper of controversy about that. So the controversy some of it was just good old fashioned misogyny, you know, that actually a big group of working class women who didn't normally get involved in art projects had visibility. And it was really hard for me as an artist, and for Richard too. And actually we stopped our collaboration around that time, not only because of that, but it was incredibly hard. And this exhibition and that book that came out of it, to my incredible surprise, anyway, there's no more controversy because there's book and stuff. But it is really an important part of its history. And I think that's part of textiles as well, you know, this kind of sense of the potential transgression, but also the tradition and all of that. So I'll just quickly go through this. So you can see this is a very different gallery, but they exhibited it hanging down the wall as they are in the Glucksman. And the Glucksman has these beautiful windows that connect to the meadow down by the river. So there's this real continuity with what looks kind of watery, but also almost like an aerial view of fields, connects to the outside, as you can see here. This is a close-up. This is me with one of the knitters 10 years on. And some close-ups. I think, and some more of the knitters, what strikes me when I am alone with this great piece of knitting, it's just, especially outside, I'm really looking forward to going to Pennsylvania, because it has this incredible sense of presence of all these thousands of women who knitted it, and that it's about a city and it's about community and it's complex, and it's really, really surprised me. It's continued to have a life and there continues to be interest in it. And that's its birthday cake. And little boy being shown it, and a close-up, and me looking in my little yellow jacket. Aren't I lovely? Right. Okay. Okay, let's move on then. So I wanted to I'm going to do this actually mostly for fun, but also in 2004, I did a performance in the city once a month in a lovely knitted outfit, somewhere outside in the city, as a way to raise profile on the project, but also to recruit knitters. And this was my favorite one. Order. It takes me a second.
I need somebody to hold my wool. Just give us a very, very exciting group here. Okay, if anybody would like to have a go, you are very welcome. Okay, so and one This is Connor, who is a man and is knitting.
The running is great.
I can't think how to get out of here now. How do I get out? Okay, so we'll move on and behave ourselves. And okay, so I wanted to talk to you about the Rainbox, which is one of the things that I've often done is I'm often kind of not entirely done with a particular story or kind of thing, and I might, you know, and it keeps working on me. And if you're an artist or you work with projects, you probably feel the same. They kind of, you know, they stay on the back burner and you're like, I'm kind of not really done with that. So that often happens. So the Spinster and the Dance Theatre piece, I wasn't done with those stories. I'm still not done, actually. I'm really interested in and I didn't tell you because I was focusing on the Sleeping Beauty and the Arachne, but I made up a whole story about spinning tops and kind of witches of spinning tops called The Spinster. And I did a radio play in 2014 using some of that text, but rewriting it, and it was a radio play. And this actually started life as a radio program, and it's moving into a kind of public art project. So I'm just going to play you just the very opening of just a couple of minutes. So this is, it's a bit of a rubbish picture, but this is Sebastian Adams. He's a young composer, and he was composer in residence at Lyric FM when I was invited to collaborate with him to make this piece, which was it's on Lyric FM, which is, most of my documentaries were on Radio 1, which is a kind of more mainstream. So this was kind of allowed to be a bit more experimental.
Weather will be mainly fair, but there will be local coastal fog and drizzle in the west and north. It will continue rather warm in all districts. Outlook for Saturday, similar. The chief item of tonight's news are British relations.
Gila, a deluge or inundation.
Gila, a deluge or inundation. Deluge. Deluge. Breathless from the garden, she bursts into the kitchen. No one. She spins around in the sudden silence and sees how the sun falls across the room. High on a kitchen shelf, the light picks out a little box. She doesn't remember seeing it before. It makes her turn her head with curiosity and then turn it to the side to check that no one's coming.
I'd love to play more, but just a bit concerned about time. But what I wanted to share with you there is that it was really delicious collaboration with Sebastian, and he was really up for playing and exploring. So you can see there we used archive Irish weather forecasting footage with a lovely British accent when it's vintage, even though it's Irish, and changed the static of the radio into rain. And you just got a little taste there. But one of the things that I became really interested in is the work of an Irish artist who has found old Irish words for water, and there's a whole section about rain, which I was really interested in, particularly because so many of these old and many of them disused words in Irish for rain, or rain really, are also descriptions of emotional states. And I was really interested in that kind of a time when there was this kind of much stronger connection with the natural world, for that's worldwide, but the particular inflection in Ireland. And so I had two Irish speakers working with us, and we worked with some of these words, and they punctuate the piece. And then you could hear me there's a beginning of a narrative thread that is about a little girl who finds this box, and inside the box it's raining impossibly. It just rains inside the box. And if you touch inside the box, then she kind of goes on, she finds all these stories. And so there are all these rainy stories. So that was 2017. And in 2019, Sebastian and I, we weren't done. And we wanted to make these, we wanted to make umbrellas. We still do, but then the pandemic got in the way. That when it rains, it tells you stories. And some of these would be the stories that we've made up, but the idea would be that people could add their own rainy stories to a kind of database, and that it would be you could kind of go to the gallery and pick up the umbrella and have these rainy stories. So this was an early prototype that we shared at a conference in Helsinki in 2019. Little did we know we wouldn't be going anywhere for a while. I can't really believe I'm even here. And it wasn't easy to get here, I have to say. But so we demonstrated an early version, and it did work. We were pouring water on the top, but we've some more work there. So whilst it isn't directly textiles, it is really in the sense that the textiles of the umbrella and how that works. So I think there's that's Sebastian with our very clunky early stage technology. But he's actually, it was interesting. He's a composer, but he's actually doing all the technology and is really into all of that, and which is great. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, great. So I just wanted to tell you about that. So before I move on and talk to you about what I'm doing here, I wanted to tell you about a collaboration that's really current, that's happening right now. I'll stop sharing. So two really lovely young women got in touch with me who have an app called Neuterino. And it's a knitting app where it helps you to knit, and it kind of and there's little, if you don't know a stitch, you can kind of click on it in this video. It's really interesting. But they have collaborated with quite a few artists actually, and they were interested in collaborating with me. So it's an early stage. I'm meeting them tomorrow, for example. But what I shared with them a story that I wrote again some years ago, but based on some of those spinstron ideas. And it's called the Girl of Balleoland. Now, quite near where I used to live in Ireland, I now live in the city centre, but is a beautiful fishing village called Ballycotton. And it's gorgeous, but there's a road that doesn't go anywhere. And from where I used to live, and I lived there for 13 years, I could see this island where there's a lighthouse, and it's a black lighthouse. And I don't know if you know, but lighthouses, at least in Europe, I don't know about the US, but they're different colors depending on where they are, and they indicate different things. But this one is black. It's kind of extraordinary. And when we first moved there, the foghorns were still in existence, but they don't have them anymore, sadly, because it was so evocative. So when the mist would come in, you'd just hear this echoing of this foghorn. But so it's very much kind of been working on my imaginary, this place. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to read just a little bit of the story that I'm in early stages of talking with Neuterino about making a book that you knit parts of the story and put it in the book as you go. So the place is called Ballycotton, and I've called it Balleoland, and Olan in Irish is wool. The Girl of Balleoland. The best part of a tidy old while ago, there lived a girl. This girl lived by the sea in a small cottage in a place called Balleoland. I should say also it's a children's story. The houses in Balleoland snuggled close to each other and peered out to sea, and at the end of the road there was a wild walk along the cliffs. Just by the shore there were two islands, a smaller one close to the village that you could walk out to at low tide, and a larger one that you had to get a boat to. All around the village there were fields and fields of sheep, and the villagers watched as fleeces grew heavy, and they whispered to the farmers that it might just be time for the shearing. And shearing meant new wool, and new wool meant that the villagers could get back to their knitting. And oh, how the people of Balleoland loved to knit. They loved the feel of wool. They loved its smell. They loved wool knotted and slipped over, wool turned behind and twisted in front on two dexterous sticks. They loved the frivolity of new wool colours and the challenge of new projects. They loved Mrs. O'Shaughnessy's new patterns for winter ties and knee-high socks in shades of emerald and purple. Everyone in Balleoland loved to knit, except, that is, for our little girl. She didn't like knitting even a little bit. She didn't like the way those needles clacked and the way that wool wound around. And she didn't like the counting of stitches, and wool made her all itchy. So one day, when everyone in Balleoland was waiting excitedly for a fresh delivery of wool, our little girl went for a walk down to the beach. She wandered out to the rocks and wondered at the purple-pink seaweed growing in the pools down near the sea. As she crouched down and peered into the small pool of water, she heard a splash close by and looked up, but she couldn't see anything except the grey sea. And so she pulled her coat a little closer and wandered further out to the low-tide rocks, and it began to rain. And the little girl watched as each raindrop splashed into the water. And as she watched, she thought she saw something turn in the sea, slow and dark, with a flash of silver green. But there is nothing. And the little girl looks up and out across the ocean. Clouds scurry across the sky, and shafts of sunlight lurch into the water. And out further than the girl has ever been, she sees a small yacht, its white sails catching the gathering breeze. Out beneath the scurrying storm clouds, there are patches of dark water, and between them, glittering sunlight plays on the waves. The girl stands and watches the moving outline of the little boat and doesn't see the slow movement at her feet. Up in the village, there is gathering glee. There are lookouts at the north end of the village waiting for the delivery of wool back from the spinning rooms in the east. A cry is thrown up into the sky, "The wool!" And the next man along the coast road takes up the cry, "The wool!" And he cries to Shauna, "The wool!" And she to Roisin, and she to Podrick, and he to Pauline, until news gets to the village that the wool is indeed coming. And out of the houses, all of the people come, the uncles and the cousins and the granaunts and the mums and the brothers, and even the dogs are excited, and the kittens, and everyone tumbles out onto the street and cheer, "It's the wool! It's the wool!" And the cheering and delight and excitement as the wool lorry turns the corner of the coast road into Balleoland, a great cheer rises up into white fluffy clouds floating above the village. Okay, that's all you get. Okay. So the story is so the story is that well, not until we publish our book, but I'll tell you a little bit about one. So obviously the little girl it's the spinstren, and the spinstren are out on the island. So it's the story of the village and the spinstren and the knitting. And yeah, well, I'm glad you want to read more. That's good. All right, so I should, I'm going to move on now to what I'm doing here. So I at the beginning, I am doing research and development for a new work. And I aim that it will be finished, we'll make it in Ireland in 2023. So for the project here, it's really early stage, and it's a real privilege for me, especially after quite a few years in senior university management, where I've had to be in charge of things, just to have time to play and explore. And the work of the project is really conceptually kind of based on the exhibition, the Knitting Map exhibition, and the idea of Tempestries, and elaborating that into performance. So I'm interested in wearing the weather and what that might mean, and that comes out of somatic practice within dance. And I'm not sure if you would be familiar with what that is. I know we've some dancers here. But for those of you who don't, somatics within dance practice is the first person experience of embodiment. And there are lots of different practices of it. And but the most important contribution that it gives is nuanced and detailed experience of what that means. And so, for example, for something like body-mind centering, that means being able to drop into the blood system or the lymph system, to explore the motion and quality of the lungs, which are, you know, if you do this, it feels hollow. It's a very different thing than your legs, which is solid. So the muscular system, the nervous system, and that through the process, and it often feels odd if you've not experienced it directly, like how could that be possible? But it is. And it's mostly because we actually don't spend time. Some of you might be interested in meditation, for example. If you're interested in meditation, you'll know that actually the process of bringing attention and being quiet gives you a different sense of embodiment. So there's this whole world of knowledge that has, in terms of the larger knowledge system of our world and our universities, have very much been pushed to the side. They're very feminized. They're often associated with dance or kind of physical practices. I'm really interested in throwing that out the window and saying this is a powerful knowledge, and it's something really politically important that we actually need right now in terms of climate emergency. So I'm going to be working with some dance artists. Undina's here today, so I'm looking forward to talking to her more about that. But I'm also really interested, when I open this, I'm really interested in playing with other technologies, and because of the space of the B2. So I'm interested in, I'm going to tell you a couple of briefly because I want us to have time to chat. I'm interested in the Irish landscape and particular stories around that, but I'm also interested in here, in what might be possible to explore here as a kind of parallel, if you like. And we will be doing a showing of some kind, but it won't be finished work, it's early stage work. And I'm interested in writing as well. So I want to tell you first about the Lady of Clúnshanna Bog, which is a story that I came up, which is not a story, it's real, but I am haunted by it. And it's one of those ones that I feel like I'm not going to be able to put down for a while. So what happened is I was asked to review a book for Cork University Press called Ancient Textiles of Ireland, Archaeological Discoveries, right? So it was, but these are ancient textiles. And all of the essays in it are written by a woman called Elizabeth Wincott Hackett, who is very elderly now. So the book is actually being put together by somebody else. And one of the chapters is called The Lady of Clúnshanna Bog. And in 2005, which for me is a very resonant year because it's the year that we made the knitting map, a mechanical peat digger, and I'll tell you more about peats in a minute. So this is a tractor that's doing this, right? Comes across a bog body, and before he can stop, it's shattered. Okay, so it's not a bog, but some of you might know about bog bodies because bogs are they're anaerobic, and the particular chemical structures that means that they're often the preserved bodies. So if you Google bog bodies, you can see extraordinary images of very ancient bodies with the flesh on them. So this wasn't like that. It was just a skeletal remains, but the textiles were there. So there were textiles on the body. So as soon as they realized what had happened, they called people in, and they came from the National Museum of Ireland. And Elizabeth Wincott-Heckett was asked to go to Dublin to the National Museum of Ireland and to look at these textiles. So the image of this body that they carbon dated it to the 7th century. So it's from 700 AD, 1300 years ago. And it's very rare to have textiles of that age. And then Elizabeth Wincott-Heckett is up in Dublin, and she's got literally hundreds of tiny fragments because it's been cut, of these textiles, and she painstakingly puts them all together, and analyzes them, and realizes that there are 7 different kinds of textiles woven in different ways. I'm looking at a video behind you of different ways to weave, and also probably a shaggy coat. It's kind of quite likely she was buried there, but we don't know. And also we know that she was early 20s. So she was a young woman, and she was of high birth. She was a lady. So so that's all I've got. I've just got this essay, but this morning, before I came here, I was just in touch with, listen to this title, Keeper of Irish Antiquities at the National, I know, she's called Maeve Sikora, and she's at the National Museum of Ireland, and that's where they are, because the photographs on this kind of photocopied essay are very poor, so I'm hoping that she'll be able to get me some photographs of them. I'm just really interested in this kind of the layering of femininities here, because you have all the women who made those textiles, the woman herself, this shattering, and then this female textile archaeologist kind of putting them together. And the way that it relates to climate is because bogs at Irish peatland are one of the biggest, and internationally they're one of the biggest sources of CO2 when they're damaged, but intact their carbon sinks, they absorb carbon. And Bord na Móna, which is the Irish peat board, which was started in 1946, have been industrially digging out peat to burn for decades. And just last year, they stopped because of a High Court action, because of the European Union, and for obvious reasons. Now, private bog retrieval of the kind of the Lady of Clinchana continues, but they are now going to be bog healers. They're going to be reclaiming bogs and working to restore the bogs, so they say. So it's just a really interesting kind of combination of things, and the fact that it happened at the same time. So I'm keen to kind of leave time enough for us for questions and discussions. I do have more, just briefly, I am really interested in traditional dye stuffs in Ireland as well, mosses and lichens especially, and I've been looking at kind of old texts that look at those. And I've also written a text, which I'm not going to read because I've read a lot today, called Moss Stitch. I'll read it if you really want me to, but let's maybe open for questions first. But that's because bogs are made from sphagnum moss over hundreds of years and kind of layered. I'm really interested in textiles and bogs. So I've written this text about moss stitch, which is somewhere between knitting and actual moss. So I'm going to stop there because I'd love to hear from you, and if you have questions or thoughts, I'll open it up.
Not really a question, but kind of a question. But I've recently seen someone who works with wool, instead of using chemicals to clean the wool and turn it into something that is spinnable and then usable, they're using the animal's actual own sweat and refuse, I guess, in a vat with vinegar to clean it, which apparently smells awful, but it works really well.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, because the way that certainly in Ireland, and I'm sure internationally, that in terms of dyeing, you need a mordant which fixes the dye, and they often used urine, or they often used also pools, bog pools, which had a very particular kind of chemical so they would leave them in these kind of nasty smelling things to to fix. So yes, yeah. Yes, Andy.
I'm really interested in the early piece that you spoke about,
Spinstering? Yes.
And how you described the technologies creating this kind of displacement of time for viewers. And I'm really interested in like whether you anticipated that or if that was a discovery you made as you were experimenting with the technologies. And you know, can you talk a little bit more about that process of making active work in relationship to technologies and how you preserve the kind of focus on the aspect over the sort of prowess, I guess, of the technologies?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So to answer your first question, no, it was absolutely a discovery that we made. And it was also, it's interesting being somebody who's an artist, but also is interested, I mean, in critical writing and theory and things, that the doing of the art is often influenced by maybe things I've read and so forth, but it also has to be, for me, it has to be outside of that, and I have to be willing not to know stuff. And but the thinking it through helps me to understand what it is I've made. And those two, it's really important for me that there's that counterpoint. Because for any of you who are kind of making work or doing projects, if you know it all at the beginning, then you know it's not really a project. It's no good. So that the process of, I suppose it came instinctively to me to make work that had content. But in those years where we were touring festivals and symposia that were specifically focused on dance and technology, we were always surprised what a rarity we were and how the majority of the work, and I see this sometimes even to this day, where the technology itself is kind of, it's like, oh, look what can do, can I, bong, bing, bong. I mean, this is exaggerating, but that if it isn't a full collaboration that really seeks to see what you can make and evoke and haunt from those technologies, then I mean, as a viewer, I'm just less engaged. It might be technologically really exciting, but it's not telling me a story. It's not making me laugh, or and that for me, the reason it was able to work for us was because I was in a long-term collaboration with Richard Paval. And so we, even before, it's when like he had the whole background, I'd never done anything like that, but I did have a kind of giddy irreverence, like, okay, let's do it then. What do you, how's that work? And we had residencies, and that was another reason that it was so lucky, because not always do you have opportunity just to play and explore without, because a lot of artists get in situation where they've got to produce, especially in dance, they've got to produce the next thing as opposed to a period of research. But we went to study in Amsterdam, which is a sound experimental center, and we experimented with Big Eye. And I remember there was lots of electric roadworks going on, so we kind of nicked these bits of poles, and I had these huge blue poles, and we were using color first of all. And the thing with color is that it's very, or at least with what we were doing 20 odd years ago, it was very, oh, it's blue on, oh, it's off. It was binary. And so you couldn't get inside the ache of movement or poetry or poetic text. So technology of using movement allowed us to enter that. And also because Richard was a really interested and innovative worker with dancers. Each of those environments worked best with one dancer, that has to be said. We did have some with three, but they were less successful, I feel. But he was able to tune the system to the movement of the particular dancer. And so it didn't work as well if something tuned for Cindy Cummings, who you saw there in that video. And then I suppose that I'm a writer and I tell stories. And so that was always part of the work. And that was always the most important thing. And I think that when you're working with artists and technologists, it's that question of like, what is the work, what is the agenda here, or what's going on? That, yeah. Does that answer your question? It's a bit of a ramble, but yeah. yeah, I'd be really interested to hear kind of what you're doing, if you're grad students, and if any of it resonates with what you're doing, or if it's different. Yes.
Yeah, I can say that. So I work in this lab over here.
Okay.
The matter lab. I work with living and organic materials.
Wow.
And I do have a background in dance, so
Do
I
you?
resonate a lot with everything you said.
Oh, wonderful.
And so my experience is very interesting in textile, and I really look forward to see what you're doing.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about that a lot right now in living things and things that we, live alongside.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Because is it ED or
LD?
LD? Sorry. Because you do biological textiles too,
Yeah.
don't you? Yeah. So
I also work with her.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm really curious about that. I have no idea what. I mean, I've read some things, but yeah, because the moss stitch bit that I've written is so it's kind of she kind of falls through time as she's knitting this moss stitch. And then she's in the forest and the moss kind of comes up her skirts until it's kind of indistinguishable between the living moss and I'm really interested in mosses. And I got seduced by Elizabeth Wall Kimmerer's beautiful writing. I don't know if you know her work. Yeah. Yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass is the famous one, but before that she wrote a book on mosses, which is just thin, but it's just really evocative and beautiful. And because Ireland is very, very wet, there's lots of moss. And yeah.
Fascinating. I also remember somewhere you were interested in spaces or how to make the space hunting, I guess.
Yes.
And I can see you're applying multiple things, right? When the dance of the movement and the narration of voice, and then now you just introduce moss and the humidity. And so to me, it's like, how do you even come up with, how do you put everything together, right? So if somebody's doing an opera, so they're thinking about, imagine the character, the story, the narrative, and then who's sing what, or compose the music. And you are playing with multiple environment and media. So is there a particular way that you can share, like, where do they all come from? How do you push it? Or do you find one and then link to the other one?
That's a really interesting question. I think, I continue to kind of research and write creatively and I find that really helpful. I'm hoping to be working with some dance artists. So even before we get into the B2, what I'd like to do is to share this work that we've done, but also to go outside here and to work in the environment and to begin to think about that connection and the idea, which is a caprice, but it's also a metaphor, which is what would it mean to wear the weather? Would we be able to connect more to it? Would we and how could that work poetically, but also as an activist strategy? So I realize we're kind of out of time, but,
yes,
but yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. We can have All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ellen.
All right.